my name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our author program tonight with Bob Boone. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be put on the library's YouTube channel within a few days. You are welcome to put your questions for Bob or Donald into the Q&A or the chat. Donald is going to monitor that during the program and answer questions as they come up. A little different from our usual format of just answering them at the end. So fire away. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Bob's newest book, which he's going to read from and discuss tonight, City U, you can do so through the publisher by going to cityubook.com, or through the bookstall in Lutz. Closed captioning will be enabled for those who want it. You can opt into it by selecting live transcription and then show subtitles. Bob will be joined in conversation with journalist Donald Liebenson, who happens to be a former student of his. Donald writes about film and books for the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and Turner Classic Movies. Bob and Donald, we're so pleased to have you here tonight. This is going to be a little bit different than usual because of a last minute tech glitch. I am going to switch places with Bob and he's going to sit in my office chair. So just a second.
There's a dramatic entrance. So thank you all for attending tonight. And thank you, Grace, for inviting me. Last month on the Friends of Everything Highland Park Facebook page, Meta, someone posted this question: who was your favorite Highland Park High School teacher? And tonight's guest's name was mentioned several times. He was certainly one of mine back in 19... And Bob Boone has been teaching for more than half a century. He is the founder of Young Chicago Authors, for which he was honored by Michelle Obama at the White House. He also runs the Glencoe Study Center at his upstairs corner office at Park Avenue in Green Bay, which he opened in 1978. I don't know how he would grade this analogy, but it gives me great pleasure to see that he is still teaching. It's like when I used to return to downtown Highland Park and see a business from my childhood still open. But we're here to talk to Bob Boone, not about teaching, but about writing. He is a prolific author of nonfiction, memoir, books of writers' prompts, and fiction. He has this new book of short stories, City U. So welcome, Mr. Boone. He will always be Mr. Boone to me. And let's begin with Bob reading an excerpt from one of his stories.
Okay, thank you, Donald. The book, of course, City U, of course, is a fictitious school. It's not a real school, but it's like a lot of real schools. It's like a community college, only it's 4 years. It's a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit in Chicago, like Northeastern University. It's a big school with a regular program. It has a lot of special programs, ESL programs, and that's what it is. And it takes place in a fictitious city, which could be Chicago, but it wouldn't have to be. The characters in my stories all are part of City U. They might be a student, they might be a teacher, they might be a counselor, they might be a neighbor, they might be a former teacher, but they take place in this story. And what interests me the most really in writing stories is not so much about writing something that's going to prove some kind of a big theme or to make some grand statement, as much as to really show people in action, exhibiting human nature at its very best and often at its not so very best. A lot of my stories have to do with people who find themselves in a tough situation and they have to work their way out. I like to think sort of, things that you want and things that you get. And I think that in teaching, there's a lot of frustration. And maybe that's one reason I'm interested in schools as a subject. But I'm going to start by reading just a short bit from a story called Ernie on the Loose. And it's narrated by Ernie. And he's a basketball player. He's in Kansas. He had been a student at City U, and he's probably going to go back again. So Ernie on the Loose. It started in Lawrence, Kansas, at a little cafe called the Busy Bee, which was not very busy that day. I was sitting in a booth eating and reading in the back, and I was the only customer. The cook was staring out the window. The waitress, a blonde girl named Daisy, was sweeping in a nonchalant sort of way. When she had swept enough, she leaned the broom against the wall near an open window and came over and slid in across from me and started talking. This was the fourth time we had talked, so we weren't strangers. Naturally, she talked about basketball. You see, I was about to start school at KU where I would play serious basketball. Daisy liked to sit in the stands at the scrimmages to watch the KU players and the wannabe players in action. It was not an actual practice, but actual players were there. Today, she wanted to know about this enormous Serbian guy named Borgen, who'd been elbowing me and pushing me all over the court. Was I as unhappy as I looked? I told her that this wouldn't happen with real referees, and also that Borgen played extra hard because he needed the scholarship. And you have a scholarship, she smiled. And she was right, I do. I have a 3-year scholarship with all expenses paid. I'm a 6'7" African-American, all stayed in high school. I went to a local City U and played 1 year. I grew and developed into a star. Not bragging, that's just what happened. The day I left for Kansas, the paper in my town had a picture of me on the front page. And the headline read, "Go to it, go for it, Ernie." It had my high school stats and my record at City U, and it had some quotes. Daisy asked if the Serb had left behind any bruises. I said no, and she said maybe the bruises were on the inside, and we laughed. I laughed a lot with her. She seemed to know a lot about basketball, and she knew a lot about me. She knew my hometown was Chicago. She knew my mom was an editor. She knew my dad was an asshole who was split up for good. Then I asked her why she looked gloomy. Was it because there'd be no more practices, no more chances to make snarky remarks? She changed the subject and asked what I was reading, and I told her it was A Stranger by Camus. She wanted to know what that was all about. I told her it was about a guy who killed an Arab in the desert. She frowned. Why do you want to do that? And I told her he did it because the sun was hot. And she asked if I read a lot of books about people who kill Arabs in the desert. And I said no, but I did like to read a lot. And then I asked her why she was frowning. And she said she was moving away. She and a friend are driving east where she had a job. But she told many people now, but she hadn't told many people. And now folks, especially her dad, were angry that she was abandoning him so abruptly. Was it a good job, I asked? And she didn't know. She said she got it from a friend of a friend of a friend. She was hired by a travel agent to help people plan trips. She said that in a few weeks, when she and her friend would be moving into the shithole apartment, I would be moving into KU's luxurious basketball dorm with all the goodies. And then instead of smiling and nodding, I said one word that stunned Daisy and really stunned me. I looked right at her, and in a softer voice, I said, maybe. Maybe, she said, maybe? Did that mean I wasn't so sure about the scholarship after all? Had I been holding back? The can't miss African-American basketball phenom, the true scholar athlete, turns his back on the future? Had she heard me right? Had I said maybe? I held up my hand surrender style and shrugged and said that before I did anything, I had to get back home the next day because a teacher friend of mine needed some help. Good teacher, she asked. The best, I said. He taught me to read. I don't get it, she said. He taught you to read? You had to be there, I answered. Anyway, I repeated, he might be in a serious trouble. Well, that's tomorrow, Daisy said. What about now? Would I want to go for a walk in the woods right now? I nodded yes, and she said she'd go and get some weeds from the cook.
Thank you. And once again, that's an excerpt from City U, and which can be purchased from cityubook.com and at the bookstall in Winnetka. So you've written, as I said, you've written nonfiction, you've written your memoir, you wrote a biography of the Chicago Cubs, Hack Wilson. You have written several books of writer's prompts. How did you get started writing fiction?
Well, when I did my dissertation way back at Highland Park, back when you and I were there, my dissertation was a narrative, was a story about what I had been doing in particular class. So it wasn't fiction, but it was a narrative. It was putting together events in a certain order. And that was kind of the beginning, but you're right, everything I did for a long time was not fiction. It was either for an audience of school teachers or students or baseball fans. So I didn't really think about myself as a fiction writer. In the 90s, I started Young Chicago Authors. And it was a very exciting program, and it was working very well. But I noticed one thing, that I was asking my students to write a lot of fiction, and I wasn't writing it myself. It seemed kind of odd. Here I was, the guy at the start of the program, but I wasn't writing fiction. So it happened that a guy named Larry Starzik was teaching just a writing course in Glencoe at a time when I was free. And I went there, and it was wonderful. I mean, he really knew how to get people to start stories and to talk about stories. And I found myself, really, I was an English teacher, but, so you use words like foreshadow and motivation and suspense and dramatic irony, but as they apply to books that you're reading. But in this case, these all applied to what I was writing, because when you're helping people, write better, when it's writing fiction, you're talking about things like this. And so I found myself really thinking about my writing in a different kind of way. Who's going to tell the story? How am I going to create suspense? And if we had a good group of people reading and asking good questions, I found myself really getting quite serious about fiction writing. And before long, I thought, well, because I know schools so well and think about schools so much, I'm just going to kind of stick to school subjects. And that's kind of how it happened, I think.
Before we get back to that, real quick, for people who are unfamiliar with Young Chicago Authors, because it's a very special program, could you just give us the elevator pitch on what that is?
Well, the way it evolved and changed a lot, but the idea was to work with young students from the city, high school age, who were interested in developing their creative writing skills, and who were in a situation in their schools and neighborhood where they weren't being given much of a chance to develop their writing. So we would recruit a certain number of students to start with us as sophomores, and they would stay for 3 years, and they would graduate after doing all kinds of writing on weekends and trips, getting their work published. And then they would go to college, and there was a small scholarship attached to it. And so we had groups of students coming through for 3 years and graduating and then moving on. But it was devoted entirely to young people, high school age from Chicago, who were really interested in developing as writers. Okay. And that's what it was. And it was fun. It was tiring. It's still there. It moved more and more into poetry slam. And now it's going back again. But I'm really away from it, but I keep track of it. And I'm still doing a lot of teaching myself in terms of creative writing.
I was going to ask you about your process, but a question has come in. And this person says that your short stories are really good, very colorful. Do you use one formula, or do you use a variety of approaches when you're writing? So, like, do you carry a notebook around, or what is your process?
Well, I do. I write notes on different things if I get an idea for a story, but I think that often I'll think of something that I want to have in a story, and then I'll have to figure out how I'm going to make a story to make this work. And there's a story in the book here called Occupy. And the way it got started is that I thought about a father and a son together who really weren't able to talk. They really could not say anything that mattered to each other. And the reason was that the mother had died, and they felt so bad about it that they couldn't talk about it. She was a hippie. She'd been a hippie, and she lived life the way she wanted to. And she followed her own rules. And people loved her, but she was very difficult, but she was wonderful. And now she was gone. And they missed her so much. And now that she's gone, they really know why they miss her, but they just aren't able to talk about it. At the funeral, all of her friends were there, and they got stoned and kind of messed things up. And so that didn't work. But I had to figure out a way, and I've got them in the same room. All I can tell you is that the father came to City U to visit the son, and finally there's a way that they end up talking. So in that case, that was my process there. And other times I'll think of something or a situation, but it's never anything that literally happened to me, but I might get some ideas from a memory. But things go wrong, and how people are going to deal with it, in the context of teaching.
To our participants, again, I encourage you to ask questions, and we will answer them throughout the show. Another one has come in, and they ask, do short stories have to come to a resolution, or do you sometimes leave the readers to come to their own conclusion?
I guess yes. I mean, I know why the story ended where it ended, and I'm quite sure that that's the right ending for it. I don't want to be really ambiguous at the end, though, and so if people imagine something else happening or predict something else happen next, that makes sense. But I don't write with that in mind. I really want the ending to be clear. It might take a while to figure out, but I'm hoping that they can. The story, Roger's Reason. I think when you read that, I think that as an ending is kind of ambiguous, but I think if you think about it, it only means one thing, but I guess that's the best answer I have.
And you work with, you're a participant, you've said, in writers' groups, and where you share your writing with other people. I have to assume you recommend that for writers or for authors?
Yes, I'm in a writers group right now with a couple of good people, Richard Reeder, and David Kelly, and we share what we're writing and talk about it. This Larry Starzik had another writing group that I got involved in very recently. In fact, a lot of stories in the book here came from that. I don't think it's necessary, absolutely necessary, but for me, it works very well. I think, you really, you listen, you have to pay attention, you really want to be helpful, and you hope the people in the group are being helpful. I mean, you don't want some mean-spirited person in there who's trying to get even for whatever reason. That's not the idea. But I think people will notice things that you haven't noticed yourself. And often the question is, what seems to be working? People talk about it, and it's really interesting to see how something will come out and you'll go back to it again. And I think the camaraderie, talking about stories, reading, deadlines, you have to get a story done and get it done on time, whatever. So I think it matters a lot. So I think they're very good. I recommend them.
Okay. We have another question. How much revising do you do on a particular story?
More and more than I used to. As a matter of fact, I'm sort of very good at getting things started, and often I don't go back as much as I should. But more and more, I'm going back. I think the clearer I get about what I want the story to be, I read aloud a lot to hear how it sounds, and I put it away for a while and go back to it. I've some people do it forever. I'm not like that, but I would say 4 or 5 times. Now, this story here that I read, Ernie, that this began as a play, and now it's back to a story. And I've done all kinds of revising and tweaking and changing. So their revising is almost putting things in a different order, creating new characters. Other times, I go back and the dialogue just doesn't sound right. I love to write dialogue. I like to get people talking. And I think I've got a pretty good ear sometimes if it's not working. And so I'll put it away and go back to it. And so that's the kind of revising that I do. And I'll certainly have other people read it, and tell me what they liked. And I hope they're being honest and see what's working. But it's all part of it.
And in terms of writers' groups, especially where dialogue's concerned, that would help you too, whether the dialogue rings true or rings false or cliched or whatever. A writers' group is a good way to sound out dialogue, I would imagine.
Yes. Often too, somebody else will read it back. You
Mm.
hear how it sounds and somebody else reads it. And that can also be very interesting.
Another question from our participants. I don't want to take credit for these good questions. What kinds of characters are you most drawn to writing about?
I think characters who think they know what they want. That at the moment I'm writing the story, something is at stake. You know, and in the beginning story, we have two guys who go on a rescue mission. And they're going to rescue this lady that they think is being mistreated in a bar. And they're going to go to the bar and kind of set things straight. And so characters like this interest me, that I think that they care about what they're doing, but at the same time, they don't quite know what they're doing. Do you get what I mean? These sort of the opportunity to sort of see more than they can see about what's all going on. But I'm interested in characters who are serious about what their life is. They think something's at stake. They're trying to do something. It might not be working very well, you know, but they're trying. I guess just very human characters, people that I know, people I can imagine. When you're teaching, you run into people all the time, you know, that are like this. But as far as a particular profession, like athletes or something like that, I don't have a favorite like that.
Here's a question I always like to ask authors, and someone beat me to it. What short story authors have influenced you, and who are your favorites?
Well, William Trevor's awfully good. And Hemingway, of course, I go back to Hemingway. I read another Hemingway story I hadn't read for a while, and how good it is. Salinger, Edna O'Brien, you know, the old favorites, Chekhov, the master. You know, I love short stories, and I love to read them over again. You know, I like to pay attention. How do they start? Somebody said, you know, start late, leave early. You know, how many good stories kind of start in the middle of things, and how the author can kind of bring in the back, the exposition, you know, very subtly. So writers like that are very important to me. I like to read the best short stories of the year, and to see how they do it, see what's working for them, how they do it, the choices they make. And a lot of it, you know, goes back to that Larry Starzyk, you know, breakthrough for me, that, you know, these questions about, you know, how is motivation created? You know, how is suspense there, that the author is able to create the impression that 2 or 3 outcomes are all credible. That's hard to do, but I think good suspense matters.
Did you grow up in a literary household? Were there books around? Were they a part of your childhood? And
there were books, you know, my parents both read. My father was reading The Arms of Krupp for like a whole year. He's a slow reader like me. He's just reading it, and telling me what was happening. My mother was always reading, but I don't think anybody calls us a literary family. But when I started reading, I mean, she was all over it. My favorite when I was little was Freddie the Pig. My favorite. Oh, you can't beat him. And I read all the Freddie books. And the minute I showed any interest in Freddie, they were all there.
Were those British?
No, American.
No? Okay.
Walter
I believe
Brooks.
we
Freddie's making a comeback too. So
great.
They are very good.
What was your library growing up? Let's give libraries a plug.
Well, the Glencoe Library and the Glencoe Library. And then before on the Highland Park Library when I was teaching. So, but I went to the library a lot. Also in reading the Bob's Merrill books, all those history books about the, you know, Benjamin Franklin, boy inventor. You know, they were orange. And the minute I started reading those, my mother bought a lot of them. My brother was a big reader. It was interesting. I was thinking about this. He read a lot of adventure books. He loved Tarzan. And he would read Tarzan. He'd reread Tarzan. Often he would read parts of Tarzan that he really liked, you know, because the description was very good, you know, just good stuff. I remember that. It's an interesting thing that you remember sometimes. But I think that kind of stuck with me. But it wasn't like, you know, nothing else in the house but books. But there were books and people read, and people valued reading.
Mhm. I'm going to expand a question that came in. The excerpt you read dealt with an African-American character, and this person asked, do you find it more difficult to write characters of the opposite sex? So we could expand that, characters of the opposite sex or sexes, and different races. How do you write for those characters that are beyond your scope of experience?
Well, the first part of it, I have no problem writing about the opposite sex. A lot of my stories feature, only women. That's not really a problem for me, I think. That's not it. I think that I don't try to go overboard getting the dialect of how I think people are going to sound. I'd rather err on the side of making them sound more like me than the other way around. I think it's what they're saying. And if it sounds natural and clear, that's the way I want it. So I think that if I'm writing more historical stuff, I might pay more attention to how people were speaking exactly at that time. But right now I kind of get them talking, and then they tell us what they're feeling and what they're going to do. And that's what I do.
Is it harder for you to write for a female character than for a male one?
I don't think so.
Okay. And what do you do? Another question. What do you do if you have a character who you find as you start out, he's just a little too perfect? So it would be autobiographical, of course. But what would you do if you had a character who you come to realize is maybe too perfect?
That has never happened. I don't know what would happen. I don't know. Because I don't have the kind of story where there's like a heroic person coming and saving the day, or the kind of character who always has the last word, with the wisest thing, or the character, whose style of living is sort of the model we're supposed to follow.
Mhm.
It's not that my stories are about losers,
Mhm.
but I'm not really thinking in terms of creating a model character. So that hasn't happened. I think if I wrote a series of stories featuring the same character, and I began to like the character and I want to keep him around, then I can imagine erring on that side. You might like him a little bit too much, or like her a little bit too much, and that'd be a problem. But I really want to make them believable. I want to make the motivation clear. I want people to understand why their dilemma really is important to them. I think the question of what's at stake for that character, this is what concerns me the most. Why things matter. Here's this guy in Kansas, he's a basketball player, he's got all the tools, but something's eating at him. It's not quite right. It's not exactly what he wants.
Mhm.
And this conversation is bringing out more. And I want people to really feel that this is a legitimate thought that he has, and a legitimate feeling that he has.
Mhm.
And that's what's important to me when I'm writing these stories.
Okay. Rebecca, I'm sorry if I got this wrong. I might have a chicken and the egg question for you. Do you have, which comes first? Do you ever imagine a character and what he or she might do, and then you come up with a story to follow for that character?
Well, a little bit what I mentioned there about the father
Mm-hmm.
and the son together, that was a situation, and I want a story to kind of make it all work. Sometimes you'll read about something happening, it's almost like an exercise, and you try to come up with a story that might have made that plausible. I used to do that with young Chicago authors sometimes, to give people something really ridiculous, like somebody burns all of his money, not come up with a story to make that legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
And but as far as when I'm writing my own stories, that's not the kind of thinking. As I say, I'll have an idea that I want, then a plot kind of comes to mind, and then I'll try to etch it out. Along the way, I might change things. I do a lot of fiddling with the point of view. I'll try to decide who should tell this story. What's a better way to do it? Because when you decide on point of view, it's what you know that that character knows, but then there's a lot that you don't know. It's very important to know what you don't know, what the reader cannot be expected to know, because that's part of the story, perhaps. So that's important to me when I'm trying to make these stories work, is the point of view. And then also where to start it, at what point to start the story, and then how to work the flashback to get the other stuff in there. These are very important matters for me.
This is a great question. What's an example of a story that you had to abandon? It just was not fated to work out. You worked it, you workshopped it, and for whatever reason, you had to abandon it. Has that ever happened?
Yeah. I can't think of any right now. Often I'll change and do something else with them. And there's a story here about a guy in Morocco. And he has these kids who are sending him notes. It's kind of a peculiar situation he's in. That had once been a much bigger story, a big travel kind of story. A long story about a lot of people traveling in Morocco. And I had plots and subplots, and then it just didn't work. So I just put that someplace. But then later on, I was thinking about a much smaller version of it, and that worked pretty well. I tried some golf stories. I have caddy stories.
Yeah.
I tried some golf stories, and they didn't quite work. And it's interesting because I'm in a sports book club right now that I started, and I'm reading a lot of sports books. And I really admire the writing. And it's hard. You read these guys. I'm reading a tennis book right now, and this description of a tennis match and how good it is, So a lot of stuff I kind of abandoned even before I start.
No,
and that's something I can't do.
So your golf stories weren't up to par.
They were not up to par. No.
Yeah.
A lot of double bogeys.
So I apologize to my wife for that one. How many of your characters in your stories have grown out of people you actually have known? So you have emphasized your stories aren't autobiographical, but that's set in schools. You taught in schools for decades. How many characters maybe have come or grown out of people you know?
One that actually did appear in a story. When I was at Highland Park, we had an early bird class. And it was for seniors in the second semester. And these seniors wanted to get out of school early, either to work or in many cases, they were working on senior projects. But by giving them English early in the morning, it freed up the rest of their schedule in the morning, and they could be out of school by noon. And so this is something that I was glad to do. I'm an early bird person. And so we had a class. It was just a basic senior English class for Highland Park kids with a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and they were good. The class started at 7:20 in the morning. We had coffee, and we had rolls and bagels, and good class. There's one girl that kept coming to class late, and she would never apologize. She'd walk in about 10 minutes late and sit back in the corner and scowl. And I'm an early person, and she was a late person, and it just wasn't working. And I kept praying that she'd start getting on time. I'd ask her, and she'd just mumble something, and then she'd be gone. And it was going on and on, if anything, getting worse. And I could tell the class wasn't complaining. They knew me pretty well. But I could tell that they didn't think it was quite right for her to wander in like that. And I didn't want to be a complete weenie about it. So I decided that I was going to do something about it. So one day she came in late, and I had planned ahead of time. And I got out of my seat. I was sitting on the desk, really, and I just kind of headed her off as she was going back to her corner. And I said, Marjorie, that we've talked about this, that you promised before that you'd be here on time. That was the idea. Everybody else, and I look back at the class, everybody else here, they're on time. You should be on time too. And then I lied a little bit. I said, I talked to the people and they can get you back into a regular English class. And she fixed this glare on me. And she said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Boone. I'm sorry. Next time I'll tell Grammy not to die in the night. And
Ouch.
then out the door and down the hall. And I could hear grumbling and chanting all the way down.
Mhm.
And then I went back in the class and I looked right at them, and they could just appreciate the whole wonderful features of this story. You know, that here was the right moment, was the wrong moment. The time I really faced up to her was the night her grandmother died.
Oh,
And we all looked at each other and we all laughed. And I'll never forget that laugh. I will never forget that laugh with the class.
mm,
It's kind of a wonderful moment.
mm.
And the next question, did she come back to class? Yes. Was she late? Yes.
Okay. As an author, do you take requests? And I guess the reason I ask this, someone would like to know, will you ever write about Harry's Delicatessen in Glencoe?
Well, I've written about places where people get together. You know, it was a great gathering place because Harry's, you know, we were sitting in kind of a horseshoe, and it was a great place to talk. There's one character named Park Taylor, you know, just a wonderful storyteller and a character. So it's a great place, you know, a little bit like Friends or something. And but I wouldn't write about it in particular. But it's a good place to remember. Good characters were there. Good Glencoe types, suburban types, city types, all were there.
Okay. I don't know what I'm walking into with this question, but have you ever written a story about a missing Mickey Mouse watch?
Well, I have friends in New Hampshire that know the answer to that. Yes. My oldest friend stole my Mickey Mouse watch at my second grade birthday party. All right.
Okay. We'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I've been holding on to this one, and someone would like to know, and it was going to be on my list of questions. It's always a question like people ask comedians, can comedy be taught? Can writing be taught?
Well, I think that if you have a creative writing class in high school, I think after you take the class, you're going to be better at writing stories. I think you're teaching people by giving them a chance to do it. I think in a creative writing class, it's the one class in school where you're asked to really go into your imagination and your memory and to do something with it. And I think if you try to make stories and do something with it, you are going to be writing. And I think by doing it, you're going to improve. I think that, you know, as I say, again, with Larry Starzyk, that once you get people writing stories, I think there is a language that you can use in talking about stories and getting people to think about what they're writing. And maybe you're not teaching them something that they don't know, but you're helping them do something better that they'd started. I think you really can get people to write a better story, you know, by giving them time and asking questions and listening well, you know. And so I guess, so I think you can. And I think it's just good to have that opportunity in school. I think that there's, you know, everything is so virtual now, you know, that there's something very concrete and specific, you know, about writing, about creative writing, you know, whether it's just a course just describing places or, you know, nonfiction courses where you're talking about events in your past to try to bring them out, you know, using language in a certain way, I think is very important. And I think the more you do it, the better you get. And so in that sense, you know, you are learning.
What would be your suggestions? Maybe let's try three, the Zoom rule of three, to help someone become a better writer.
Well, let's say a person comes to me and they have been writing for a while and now they're considering quitting. Okay. So I've stacked the deck a little bit already. So number one, don't quit.
Okay.
Number two, go back to some earlier stories that you've started and do something dramatic with it. Have somebody else tell the story. Start it someplace else. Change the tone a little bit. You know, maybe add something to the story. You know, try that. You know, I'm assuming that the person who asked me that would really like to do it, just sort of looking for reasons to go back to writing. And then I'd just give them books to read, stories to read, and just to take a look at this Hemingway story, the end of something, and watch how it all fits together. So I think that's how I'd approach it. When I'm working with students who have not written at all, Mark Larson and I wrote a couple of creative writing books. One is called Moe's Cafe, and one is called Jones Junk Shop, and it's full of writing prompts. And there, we're working with a younger audience, perhaps people who have never written creatively before, and we have a lot of prompts, and many of them are like the Moe's Cafe, where I have my students imagine that they're in a real dump of a place, and I'll have them imagine why they're there. Then I'll give them 10 questions quickly. Tell me about the floor, tell me about the waitress, tell me about the menu, and write down very quickly, just little, not even full sentences, get all 10 of them answered. And now you eat, and now you go home. And I want you to write a letter to your friend, telling your friend what it was like being in Moe's Cafe. So I have a lot of things like that. So if I'm working with somebody who hasn't written before and just wants to feel kind of the joy in it, the fun of writing like that, I have a lot of those. I think a lot of creative writing teachers they're kind of armed with little gimmicky things like this, often first sentences or last sentences. That could be another way to get people writing. I think the assumption, Donald, is that once people get writing and feel themselves writing, and they're kind of surprised that they can do it, then some good things can happen. And so just getting it started. And so, what Mark Larson and I did, we came up with a whole lot of these little starter ideas to, push people along and to find this writing voice they have.
You anticipated my next question about prompts, and I don't want to put you on the spot. You talked about Moe, but I was wondering for the budding writers who are watching tonight, can you give us a prompt that they might take away from tonight and might inspire them to start writing?
Well, as I say, first sentences are pretty good. Life in our family was never the same after Granny took up kickboxing. That's the first sentence. That's the first sentence of a story, okay?
Okay.
Go from there.
All right. I want to see those on our desks tomorrow morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Your colorful context of your stories, here's another question for you, are what make them come alive for this person who is asking the question. To what degree of detail are you able to gauge your work, and how much is too much?
I think that I err too much on simplicity. Often I'll look at other people's writings and I'll wish that maybe I had done more, with a scene, more detail. I can do it if I want, but sometimes I get carried away with the story and the dialogue. And I do like short stories. I like short stories, and I like kind of trimmed down stories, and I like dialogue to carry the story. I believe in all of those. That's kind of, my way of doing it. But I think that maybe in my next stories I'll make an extra point of doing a little bit more in describing the scenes, because I think I can do it, and I might add to it. I think it can't take over a story, but I think sometimes that the show and tell, that's kind of the old thing you hear in creative writing classes, that you show it, don't tell people, create something so the reader will figure out for himself what's going on.
How short can a short story be? And conversely, how long can it be before it becomes a novella? But how short is short?
Well, they have those 6-word story contests, and they have, very, very short. I think a lot of longer stories, sometimes they could be shorter. I get that feeling that sometimes you get the feeling sometimes a writer just sort of wants to keep going, and nothing really is achieved by it. But it's hard, because sometimes you just, once you decide where you think the story is going to be, and you know it has to include, and then you put it in there, and then you get the feeling the story is done. You know, this is the shape it's going to be in, this is the size it's going to be in. And I've never written fiction where I've had a word count, where I've had to put more words in or take words out. You know, so that really hasn't been a concern of mine. As I say, I read long stuff, you know, and I read a lot of short stories and middle-length stories. I like to read. And they usually, you know, I guess if it reaches the point where it's been published, it's probably, you know, a lot of people have been added already, the editors, to make sure the edit, you know, it's about the right length.
To the anonymous attendee who wants to know what kind of a student Donald was, we will save that for another time. But
I will say this, that of the favorite classes I had at Highland Park, we had a summer school class, creative writing, remember that?
yeah, I was going to bring that up because they also wanted to know what kind of a teacher you were, and that I would reflect on for a minute or two. But you take it.
Well, I just remember the class. I remember the students in the class. I remember the bike parked in the back, and it was a wonderful experience. Of course, you know, that's the only class students have. I think that's something you're aware of, that in a school, any school really, when students have so many classes, you know, and then you're competing with 4 other teachers, might be the chemistry teachers, the language teachers, and all of this. In the summer, when you get people in just one class, you know, and they can spend in a long class, so you can spend a lot of that class time on writing. I mean, it was teachers' heaven.
And it was a student's heaven. I didn't have to take summer school, but you got me excited about writing, so I wanted to take that class. And the kind of teacher Bob was he engaged us. He got us excited about reading. We had the traditional teachers, Miss Borman, and they were all about outlining a sentence and all that. And not that Bob wasn't interested in the technicalities, but he got us excited about writing. If memory serves, and memory has been kind of slow of late, but didn't you teach a pop culture class? You showed us a beach party movie.
Oh, Beach Blanket Bingo.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
That was a class that my second year at Highland Park, the curriculum changed to 9-week courses. And I taught a course in communications. In fact, this became the subject of my dissertation at Northwestern. But the communications class is it was other ways that people communicate, you know, talking about television and film, you know, and the different theories of language and all kinds of individual projects. And yes, we did watch Beach Blanket Bingo twice.
Yes, that was. But I do, you know, the memories are coming back. That summer school class, I remember you paired, excuse me, you paired me with Ted Fishman. You paired, you know, students together so they could work with each other, work off each other, share strengths, and, you know, each pairing created their own story. And it was just a great experience. But enough about me. We have another question here from Roberta, and she says that she has just started to write a memoir of her time as a bookseller, and she's hung up on, did this or that really happen? How much do you have to remember about an incident? How accurate does it have to be? So basically, how much detail do you need? It's not a documentary, but how much do you need to remember?
Well, that's interesting. Now, I did write a memoir called Inside Job, and it was published in 2002. And it really told the story of how I left Highland Park as a more or less traditional teacher, and then eventually started Young Chicago Authors. And just sort of it was a lot of creative writing that came into my life. Also a lot of city teaching. I did a lot of work in the city, a lot of work at Cabrini Green. And it was a memoir about that time. So it was not an autobiography, it was a memoir. But often I remember, but I wasn't sure exactly what the sequence was. And I just have to kind of guess in that case. I kind of thought I knew, but, in terms of it. Other times I would create kind of composite characters if I wanted to describe a scene accurately. I couldn't remember everything about the scene, but I knew what had happened. I knew the kind of people that were there. I didn't get all of their names all the time. So I'd have to either make up names or and somehow describe them. So I think there's a little bit of guessing. I think that it's the best you do. I think if it's a good story, and if you're sticking to the lines and the reader knows why you're including this episode, this part, this description, if it really belongs, I think sometimes you're just going to have to just, the best guess. But things do slip away, and I'm aware of that. And then sometimes I look at the book and read parts of it, and I say, oh, there's something else I should have put in there. A lot of it, you see, had to do with young Chicago authors. And so I'd use a lot of selections of their writings in the book. And then later on, I think, I could have used something else. And that was kind of interesting. But, I don't worry about that as much anymore because I haven't written, a long true story for a long time. But I know what Roberta's talking about.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's not for everybody, but do you recommend keeping a journal?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend them. I don't always do it myself, but I think it's good. I think it's good to do it. I think that sometimes rather than taking notes on what's happening, let's say you really, you want to remember a concert, you want to remember a trip that you've taken, rather than taking feverish notes, I think that maybe writing down the key words and then go off by yourself sometime and try to connect them all together. So the journal becomes also kind of a creative act. I think sometimes people want to write so much in their journal, they kind of lose track of what they're doing. But I think it's good to have a journal there and to look at it. I think it's good to read it later on. I'll keep a journal when we travel, and I'll look back and I'll forget stuff that we did, and stuff that seems much more important now than it did then. And so I think it is. I think, again, because so much stuff is virtual, we're not touching, it's any chance you get to write something down, to be particular, to really pay attention to the senses. I think that's good.
And you've talked about the value of writing groups. And some people might be nervous about sharing their work out loud. How do you recommend people who want to try one to tips for choosing a writers club, a writing group that would be a good fit for them? Are there any tips for that?
There's nothing like word of mouth. If you heard ahead of time that this group is good, that person's a good leader, the more you hear about something, I think that's very important. If you don't know, if you move and you're in a new town, you want to get into a writing group, you hear the library has something, you don't want to jump into it. I think the obvious, I would talk to the leader and find out. I think that, there's that fine line. I mean, you don't want to be just so completely positive that it's not very helpful at all, but you don't want to get in a nasty situation for whatever reason, people really get dirty, and you don't want that. I mean, it should be a positive experience, and you should leave it, understanding more about yourself and your writing and the other people too. So I think common sense gets involved, but I think you can find out a lot, and people talk and people share ideas, and you can find out.
Okay.
I mean, if somebody asked me around here, if there's a writing group, I might not know anything in particular about the group, but I could find out just because I would know somebody that would, and I could ask some questions that help out, and sometimes that could be good. I think people can be very fearful. They're afraid of having their work. I know when we had the open mic here at the Glencoe Library for years, it was always very satisfying for people who had never read before, who would finally get up and read and find out it was fun, they liked it, and people liked it. So if you can get people to do it, but I understand that Robert Frost, a nice little old man in a writing group, he was like the nastiest person on earth. He was just awful. And of course, that's at a very high level. Masters of Fine Arts kind of programs. And I'm talking more of a conversational neighborhood kind of a writing group, getting people started, getting started again. I think that describes a lot of people. People who at one time or another, they wrote some fiction and they kind of gave it up, but they really would like to get started again. I think that's a big group that we're talking about here. And I think that they should try it.
Okay. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I want to thank all the participants and those who asked those great questions. The book is called City U, and that's the letter U. You can get it at cityubook.com. You could also get it at the bookstall in Winnetka. Support your independent bookstores, please. And do you have other books you want to tell us where we can get them? Like there was your first book of short stories about Forest High.
Well, Forest High and Back to Forest High. Now you can get those through Amica Press. And books that I've done with Mark Larson, Moe's Cafe and Jones Junk Shop, these two books of prompts, that they are with Globe Press. That's not right. I can't remember the name of it. Amazon. You can get that with Amazon. I'm sorry. Okay. And then also Mark Larson and I did a book called Right Through Chicago, which is a book of writing prompts about writing about Chicago. And that's also Amica Press.
Okay. Well, until Grace comes in to put an official amen to this, there's one recurring theme through your stories, the Chicago Cubs. If you wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship with the Chicago Cubs, they turn up a lot.
Well, I'm a Cub fan. I wrote a book about Hack Wilson. And the first story in this book about these two guys that try to rescue the girl, they are motivated, or at least one of them is motivated by the Cubs just winning the World Series. And he is so excited by that he feels he ought to do something good. This year, of course, is not something we're talking about, and I see what happens next. But yeah, I'm a Cub fan. I'm a Chicago sports fan. And I think that was fun with writing about Hack Wilson, to be able to write about somebody on a team that you really like. And both Jerry Grunsko, he was my department chairman and a good friend. He and I were writing partners for that book. And we both knew that Hack had these great records, but nobody had written a book about him. So it was like not Joe DiMaggio or something like that. And so it was this wonderful opportunity to go out there and write a book about somebody who'd never been the subject of a long book. That was very exciting.
Oh, that's great. Well, again, thank you very much for tonight. And we look forward to the next project. What are you working on now?
I'm going to work on more stories for another City U.
Oh, okay.
I've got some other ones I want to write.
Okay.
And I've got some other ideas too, but I've got several now that I think are going to work. So, and I like to work on them. I like to have something to think about when I'm doing something else. And so that's what I'm going to work on. As
teaching, because you're still teaching, has that made you a better writer?
I think it's made me a better reader too. I think the more I write like this, I think the better I read. I have read it. I have taught at Oakton for about the last 9 years in the ESL and the literacy department. Right now, I'm just doing some book clubs at Oakton, but I've worked a lot with ESL students. And I tell you, Moe's Cafe works very well, with students who are just learning the language. I've done a lot of creative writing, prompts with my students, who are in this other group of people who are just learning English. So that's been very interesting for me.
Okay. I keep coming up with questions, but no, we'll put an amen to that. And thank you again, Mr. Boone. And thanks to all who participated tonight.
Okay, thank you, Donald. Good job.
Good night.
Good night.